My name is Isabella Jordan. I am 34 years old, born and raised in Boston, Massachusetts. My father's name is Michael Jordan, a kind man who always tried his best, but could never fully understand the quiet storm inside me. I have never been married, I am a virgin. I am a housewife, though many fail to understand the depth of what that entails. My life has largely revolved around caring for my family, keeping a home together, and quietly navigating the expectations of society and my own conscience. Dear listener, thank you so much for tuning in. Please subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and let me know in the comments what country you are listening from. I truly appreciate it. Enjoy the story. I grew up learning how to be invisible. Silence was always rewarded more than honesty. When I stayed quiet, people were comfortable. When I smiled, people assumed I was okay. When I swallowed my pain, no one had to deal with it. I learned early that being easy was safer than being real. I remember standing in front of the bathroom mirror as a young girl, practicing smiles. Not the big, joyful ones, those were too honest, but the soft ones. The kind that said, "I'm okay, don't worry about me." That smile followed me into adulthood. It sat on my face through heartbreaks, disappointments, and moments when I felt like I was slowly disappearing. I became the woman who listened to everyone else's problems. The woman who showed up. The woman who remembered birthdays, checked in late at night, and stayed longer than she should have. People called me strong. They said I had a good heart. And I believed that was my purpose, to be strong so others wouldn't have to be. But no one tells you what strength costs. Strength cost me my voice. Strength cost me my boundaries. Strength cost me myself. There were days when I would come home, close the door behind me, and lean against it just to breathe. My chest would feel heavy, like I was carrying something invisible but unbearably real. I would sit on the floor, still wearing my shoes, staring at nothing, wondering how I could feel so full of emotions and yet so empty at the same time. I wasn't unhappy all the time. That's the part people don't understand. I laughed, I worked, I loved, but underneath everything was a quiet exhaustion, a deep, soul-level tiredness that sleep never fixed. It came from constantly giving pieces of myself away and never getting them back. I loved deeply, too deeply. I loved people for who they could be, not for who they actually were. I made excuses for their absence. I forgave apologies that never came. I stayed in situations longer than I should have because leaving felt like failure, and I had already failed myself too many times. My life as a housewife added another layer of invisibility. Society expects a certain type of quiet perfection. Guests must be welcomed warmly, meals prepared on time, rooms spotless. I learned to hide my frustrations beneath a polite smile, to bury my fatigue behind effortless conversation. Even in the small domestic routines, I felt the weight of being expected to perform constantly, yet never be seen as anything more than a caretaker. I remember my 20s most vividly. Those were the years I should have been discovering myself, exploring my identity, learning who Isabella Jordan really was. Instead, I spent the days inside a cycle of service and obligation. I maintained the home, cared for the elderly neighbors, ran errands for my family, and hid in the evenings with a book or soft music, pretending that the world outside didn't notice my absence. Sometimes, I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if anyone would care if I just disappeared for a day, or a week, or longer. The thought terrified me and comforted me at the same time. Terrified me because it was a reality I couldn't accept, and comforted me because it reminded me that I had long ignored my own needs. I had friends, yes, but they didn't know me fully. We laughed together. We went to movies and dinners. But I always held back the darker, quieter parts of myself. I didn't want to burden them with my sadness, my doubts, or my loneliness. And somehow, I believed that to be truly kind, I had to endure it alone. Work and life beyond my household also taught me the subtle ways society undervalues women like me. Even when I tried to engage in community projects or local volunteering, my contributions were often overlooked. People would nod politely, smile, and move on, as if my energy and my words were invisible. It hurt, but I accepted it. I had been trained to believe that my worth was in giving, not in being recognized. There was a point when I realized this pattern wasn't going to end on its own. One rainy afternoon, I stood by the window, watching the water streak across the glass. I felt my shoulders slump under the invisible weight of years of compliance and self-erasure. And I thought to myself, how long am I going to let this continue? How long before I finally see myself? It wasn't a sudden revelation. It was quiet, almost imperceptible at first. But the more I ignored it, the louder it became. It whispered in my ears during chores. It tugged at my heart when I tried to sleep. It demanded that I acknowledge its existence. That whisper was my truth. And for decades, I had ignored it. It took me months to understand that strength isn't just enduring for others. True strength is enduring for yourself, even if it means disappointing the world. And in that realization, I began to see a path forward. Not a dramatic path, not a life-changing miracle. Just the small steps of acknowledging myself, validating my own feelings, and honoring my own presence in the world. I want you, dear listener, to understand this. If you have spent years giving yourself away, hiding your pain, and shrinking in silence, your voice deserves to be heard. You are allowed to claim space in your own life. You are allowed to say no. You are allowed to prioritize yourself. This story isn't about blaming anyone. It isn't about pointing fingers or cataloging wrongs. It's about acknowledging the quiet battles women fight every day behind closed doors. It's about the strength we show the world while hiding the fragility within ourselves. And it's about finally giving ourselves permission to breathe. I want you to stay with me, because my journey is far from over. My voice, once buried, is beginning to rise. My story, once silent, is beginning to be told. And this is only the beginning. I woke up that morning with a heaviness I couldn't shake, a weight pressing down on my chest as though the air itself had grown thicker overnight. The sunlight streamed through my bedroom window, but it didn't feel warm or welcoming. It felt intrusive, as if the day itself were judging me for the life I had been quietly living. I got out of bed slowly, my bare feet brushing the cold floor, each step echoing the monotony of countless mornings before. The same routine awaited me: coffee, breakfast, tidying up, and the endless list of chores that seemed to multiply overnight. I moved through these motions mechanically, like a ghost inhabiting a familiar shell, trying to convince myself that I was awake, alive, and in control. But my mind had other plans. It wandered, drifting back into memories long buried under years of silence and duty. I thought about the times I had been invisible, even in the spaces where I had tried so hard to belong. I thought about my mother, her gentle smile hiding her own regrets, and how she had tried to prepare me for a life I was now beginning to question. "Isabella, you must always be strong," she would say. "People will depend on you, and the world doesn't wait." I had obeyed those words for decades, molding myself into someone capable, reliable, and quiet. But obedience had a price, a cost measured in pieces of myself I could never recover. As I sipped my coffee, I realized how little I truly knew about myself. For years, I had been living in service of everyone else, a silent witness to my own erasure. I had perfected the art of smiling while my heart ached, of nodding politely while my soul screamed for recognition. I had learned to speak softly, to give gently, and to remain unseen. But today, the quiet voice inside me demanded more than polite silence. I remembered the days when I was younger, when life had seemed full of possibility. I had dreams, small yet vivid ones, traveling to new cities, learning to play the piano, writing stories that no one would read but that meant something to me. But every dream had been paused, postponed, or quietly abandoned in the name of responsibility and duty. My aspirations had been tucked away neatly, like letters I could no longer send. And now, decades later, those letters weighed heavy on my heart. Walking through the kitchen, I thought about my neighbors. I had been friendly with them for years, always offering help, listening to their troubles, attending every small event. They called me kind. They said I was dependable. But no one ever asked me how I was, what I wanted, or how the world felt from my perspective. Their kindness was never meant to be cruel, but it left me feeling hollow, as if my existence mattered only when I served someone else's needs. I spent the morning doing chores, my hands busy but my mind wandering. The dishes, laundry, and cleaning had become meditative rituals in a strange way. They allowed me to think, to process, to observe myself from a distance. I thought about the small acts of sacrifice I had made for my family, waking early to prepare meals, listening to my father recount the same stories, attending social gatherings I did not enjoy, hiding my frustrations behind a polite smile. Each act, while outwardly normal, had slowly eroded the sense of who I was. By midday, I found myself sitting by the window, staring out at the city. Boston was alive, people walking dogs, children playing, cars honking, the distant murmur of life continuing its unstoppable rhythm. And yet, I felt separate, like a spectator of my own existence. It wasn't despair, not exactly. It was a quiet recognition that I had been living in survival mode, not truly alive. My mind traced the countless days and years of being responsible for everyone but myself, and I realized that I had almost forgotten what it meant to act for my own happiness. I remembered the friends I had made over the years. They knew me well enough to enjoy a conversation, a laugh, a coffee together. But I had withheld the deepest, most vulnerable parts of myself. I had shared smiles, stories, and pleasantries, yet the core of Isabella, the longing, the doubts, the quiet ache for recognition and freedom, remained locked away. I had feared that if I revealed it, I would be rejected or considered too much. But what I didn't see then was that holding back had been a heavier burden than any judgment could ever be. The afternoon passed slowly. I worked quietly, organizing my home, ensuring everything was in order. My hands moved automatically while my thoughts churned relentlessly. I considered the years I had spent perfecting the art of invisibility, the ways I had minimized my own presence to make room for everyone else. It struck me how deeply embedded this pattern was, almost instinctual. I had internalized the idea that my needs, desires, and emotions were secondary. I had been trained to endure silently. Then, in the stillness of that late afternoon, I had a startling realization. The voice I had ignored for decades, the one that whispered during quiet moments, the one that trembled behind smiles, was now growing louder. It was insistent, demanding, and impossible to dismiss. "You are alive, Isabella," it said. "You deserve more than this. You are worthy of your own attention, your own care, your own joy." I felt a mixture of fear and relief. Fear, because this was unfamiliar territory. Relief, because for the first time in years, I recognized my own existence as valid. It was as if I had been walking through a fog for decades and, suddenly, the sun had broken through. The clarity was overwhelming, exhilarating, and terrifying all at once. I spent the next hour writing in my journal, pouring out thoughts and feelings I had never dared to articulate. I wrote about the quiet struggles, the silent victories, and the persistent ache of wanting to be recognized not just for what I gave, but for who I was. I wrote about my fears of failing, of being misunderstood, of being too much or not enough. And as I wrote, I felt something shift within me. The weight I had carried for so long began to lighten, replaced by a fragile, tentative sense of hope. By evening, I realized that I had taken the first step in a long journey. I didn't have all the answers. I didn't know what changes I would make, what risks I would take, or how my life would look in the coming months. But I knew one thing with certainty: I would no longer silence the voice inside me. I would no longer prioritize everyone else's comfort at the cost of my own. I would no longer live as a ghost in my own life. That night, as I lay in bed, I reflected on the day's revelations. I understood that healing would be gradual, messy, and uncertain. But I also understood that it was necessary. I understood that I had the power to claim my own life, to honor my own emotions, and to acknowledge my own existence. For the first time in decades, I felt the stirrings of self-recognition, a sense that I could be both strong and vulnerable, both caring and selfish, both responsible and free. This chapter of my life was not about dramatic transformations or immediate changes. It was about the quiet, steady reclamation of self. It was about beginning to live with awareness, intention, and honesty. And it was about the first step in finally speaking my truth, not just to the world, but to myself. The night deepened, and I closed my eyes with a strange mixture of exhaustion and anticipation. Exhaustion from decades of silence, anticipation for the long road ahead. And though the future remained uncertain, I felt a seed of hope planted deep within me, a promise that I would no longer disappear into the lives of others, that I would no longer ignore my own voice, and that I would finally listen to the whispers of my heart. And so, the journey continues, and this story, though just beginning, carries with it the weight of decades of untold truths, unspoken fears, and quiet resilience.
By August, I had begun to see my marriage for what it truly was. What I had once believed was love, care, and devotion, was nothing but manipulation, control, and obsession. Nathan Cole was a man who could smile while plotting your destruction, a man who could whisper affection while holding a knife in his metaphorical hand. Silverbrick in August was deceptively calm. The ocean roared softly against the cliffs, gulls wheeled in the bright sky, and the town carried on with its predictable rhythm. Children played along the pier, tourists wandered the streets, and neighbors chatted over fences. To the outside world, life seemed perfect. But my home, my supposed sanctuary, was a laboratory of secrets, a place where fear thrived quietly, invisibly, and dangerously. I had spent weeks collecting information, observing Nathan, noting every pattern, every nuance, every inconsistency. I had found the hidden files, the secret photographs, the meticulously maintained diaries that mapped my life in ways I couldn't have imagined. And now, I needed to go deeper. I needed to uncover the truth behind the man I had married, the life I had willingly given myself to. I began with his financial records. At first glance, everything seemed normal: investments, taxes, legitimate transfers. But then I noticed subtle anomalies: transfers to accounts with no apparent business purpose, payments to obscure companies registered overseas, and small sums sent repeatedly at odd hours. The money was not the most alarming thing. It was what accompanied it: correspondence, hidden emails, encrypted files. Nathan was conducting business I could not understand. Worse, there were files labeled projects and subjects. The word subjects made my stomach twist with unease. One evening, when Nathan left for a supposed late dinner with a client, I took a deep breath and accessed one of these encrypted files. My computer hummed softly as it decrypted the contents. And then I saw it, a collection of documents and videos cataloging experiments, or, as I came to understand, manipulations, conducted on people he claimed were trusted participants. Some were recordings of volunteers for research programs. Others were clearly private individuals, people whose lives Nathan had invaded, observed, and controlled. It became horrifyingly clear that my own life was part of a carefully orchestrated plan. I remembered the pills, the meticulous attention to my schedule, the cameras, the files. It was all connected. I was not married to Nathan Cole. I was a participant in his experiment, the subject of his obsession, a person meticulously monitored, catalogued, and controlled. I sat in the dark, laptop screen glowing, heart pounding. My fingers trembled as I scrolled through the documents. Photos of strangers in their homes, videos of people sleeping, notes on their behavior, analyses of their habits, reports on their reactions to stress, isolation, and fear. And then there were notes on me, detailed observations spanning months, predictions, and strategies. It was like reading the diary of a man who had been constructing my life from the shadows, shaping every moment without my knowledge. I knew then that fear alone would not keep me safe. Knowledge would, awareness would, and I had to remain unseen, unheard, unnoticed. I began to map Nathan's network. Names, dates, addresses. People he associated with, people he used, people who knew pieces of his life but not the whole truth. The more I discovered, the more horrifying it became. Nathan was not merely controlling his home, he had an empire of secrets, a web of manipulation extending far beyond Silverbrick. Sleep became a strategy. I pretended exhaustion, pretended obedience. Each pill I took was carefully timed, each smile measured, each word rehearsed. Nathan never suspected I was becoming aware, never suspected I was cataloging his every movement, his every word, his every deception. And then, one night, I found a key, a physical key hidden under a loose floorboard in his study. It unlocked a small, hidden cabinet that I had overlooked before. Inside were files, photographs, journals, and, most alarmingly, personal items belonging to other women, women who had disappeared from the public eye, leaving no trace behind. My stomach turned. Each item was labeled, dated, catalogued. Nathan had collected them meticulously, just as he had collected my life. The realization hit me like a tidal wave. I was not his only subject. I was part of a pattern, a cycle that had been repeated countless times, and I was now in the center of it. The following days were a careful dance. I pretended normalcy while planning. I watched him. I recorded him. I observed his patterns, his routines, his weaknesses. Nathan was brilliant in his planning, but he was predictable in his obsession. His need for control was his greatest vulnerability. I also began documenting everything in my own journal, which I hid in a waterproof case beneath the floorboards in the attic. I labeled it Evidence, Ariana Blake. Every note, every observation, every fear was meticulously recorded. This was no longer about surviving nights with him. It was about building a record, proof of the man behind the smile, proof that I could use to protect myself. One evening, as Nathan was out for one of his extended meetings, I accessed a particularly sensitive folder. It contained video recordings, dates spanning months, of people in their homes, terrified, unaware, under his observation. And then there were plans, written notes, and calculations, all pointing to the inevitability of control. Nathan's obsession with dominance, with surveillance, with manipulation, had a methodology, a cruel logic, a system. I realized something that night. I was not just surviving. I was learning, and every detail I uncovered made me stronger, sharper, more aware. I began to think about my next steps. Every day, I had to calculate risk. What could I observe? What could I record? What could I do without tipping him off? Every interaction became a test. Every conversation a careful negotiation. And as my awareness grew, so did my determination. I remembered my father's advice: never let anyone convince you that your mind is broken. His words had been my lifeline in childhood, and now, they were my anchor in adulthood. I would not let Nathan break me. I would not let him erase me. By mid-August, I had created a meticulous plan. Observations, recordings, hidden files, all carefully labeled. I had discovered weaknesses in his control, gaps in his surveillance, moments where he became vulnerable, overconfident, or inattentive. I knew that the next phase, confronting the truth, preparing my escape, exposing his darkness, was coming. Nathan's empire of secrets was vast. His control over his home, his life, and his subjects was terrifying. But I had uncovered the pattern. I had discovered the method. And most importantly, I had discovered my own power. The final night of August arrived with the usual calm. The ocean roared quietly in the distance. Nathan kissed my forehead, smiled, whispered his usual assurances. But I was ready. I knew his patterns, his obsessions, his weaknesses. I had learned to move like a shadow, to observe without being observed, to survive without revealing my awareness. For the first time since our marriage began, I felt a sense of clarity, a flicker of control. I was no longer merely a participant in his experiment. I was a strategist, a planner, an observer, and the next move was mine. That night, I hid the pills, activated hidden recordings, and began preparing for the confrontation that I knew was inevitable. I didn't yet know how it would end, but I knew one thing: I would not be erased. Nathan Cole's darkness had been revealed to me, and I was ready to face it. The first step in taking control of my life was understanding that Nathan Cole had never truly been my husband. He was a predator disguised as a partner, a man whose love had always been a mask for obsession. And now that I had uncovered the extent of his surveillance, his manipulations, and his dark network of secrets, I knew there was only one way forward: I had to escape. Silverbrick had always seemed peaceful to outsiders. Its narrow streets, quaint coffee shops, and the endless horizon of the ocean gave the town a serene charm. But I no longer saw the town through the lens of calm. Every familiar corner, every quiet alley, every neighbor's glance was a potential threat, or a potential ally. The freedom I sought would require planning, patience, and precision. I began my preparations methodically. First, I needed information. Not just about Nathan, but about the world beyond him. I memorized his routines, the timing of his meetings, his frequent trips to the city, and the moments when his attention waned. Every detail was a piece of the puzzle I would use to orchestrate my freedom. Then I turned my focus to resources. Hidden funds, small cash reserves, and emergency contacts I had slowly built over months without him noticing. Every spare dollar, every discreet phone number, every overlooked tool in the house became part of my arsenal. I also reinforced my hidden observation points. Cameras I had placed months ago now served as surveillance for my surveillance. I knew when Nathan entered the study, when he moved through the kitchen, when he checked his phone. I became a shadow in my own home, invisible yet omnipresent, gathering intelligence with a quiet precision. Sleep became strategic. Each night, I pretended exhaustion, took the pills as needed to maintain appearances, but secretly monitored Nathan's movements. I tracked his emails, his files, even his subtle habits, the way he lingered too long in front of mirrors, the way he adjusted the lighting, the way he checked locks and windows. Every detail told a story. Every story revealed a vulnerability. By early September, I had a plan. It was not a reckless escape. It was a calculated operation. I would leave Silverbrick quietly, avoiding detection, taking with me the evidence I had collected over months, photographs, recordings, journals, and digital files. I would expose Nathan Cole for who he truly was. And I would survive. But executing this plan meant facing the man I had married, the man I had trusted, and the man who had never truly loved me. It meant confronting the psychological prison he had built around me and walking out with my sanity intact. I started small, testing boundaries, leaving the house for longer periods under the guise of errands, monitoring his reactions, noticing how he reacted when I wasn't immediately available, when he didn't have complete control over my schedule. Each experiment provided insight. Each misstep taught me caution. I also began storing emergency supplies, cash hidden in hollow books, food in discreet containers, extra clothing in unlikely places. I packed items I would need without raising suspicion. Every detail mattered. One mistake could be fatal. One evening, Nathan returned earlier than expected. I had planned a night of observation, a small test to see how long he would notice my absence from the study. His sudden arrival sent a shiver down my spine. But I stayed calm. I smiled. I acted as if nothing was amiss. He approached me, gently touching my shoulder. "Everything okay, Ariana?" he asked, his tone soft but probing. I nodded, not letting a flicker of fear show. "Yes, just tired." He seemed satisfied, but I knew the danger in underestimating him. The man I had married could sense even the slightest deviation. Weeks passed with careful execution of my plan. I refined my strategy, rehearsed my movements, and anticipated every possible scenario. I began to imagine my life beyond Nathan, freedom, sunlight unfiltered by fear, nights where sleep was genuine and unthreatened. But as the plan grew clearer in my mind, so did the stakes. Nathan's obsession with control had no limits. He could detect subtle changes in behavior, shifts in routine, or the smallest hint of rebellion. Every day was a delicate balance between observation and deception, between courage and caution. One night, I discovered something that changed everything. While reviewing his files, I found a set of hidden correspondences with someone identified only as M. The emails were cryptic but alarming, references to past subjects, failed experiments, and strategies for control. And then there was a plan that mentioned my name directly. Nathan had been anticipating my moves, calculating my reactions, and preparing contingencies. I realized that while I had been careful, he had been watching me in ways I hadn't anticipated. The escape I had meticulously planned was now under threat. The predator was aware, and the stakes were higher than ever. The days that followed were tense. I became more vigilant. Every sound, every shadow, every movement in the house was scrutinized. I hid my growing knowledge behind smiles, laughter, and the illusion of compliance. Nathan remained outwardly charming, but his subtle manipulations increased. He monitored my moods, tested my reactions, and maintained his silent psychological control. Despite the danger, I persisted. My preparations intensified. I memorized routes out of Silverbrick, identified safe houses, and discreetly contacted allies who could assist if needed. I reinforced my digital security, ensuring that every recording, every file, every piece of evidence I had gathered was protected. I could no longer afford mistakes. Then came the night when I made a crucial discovery. Hidden in a cabinet, behind false panels, I found items that revealed Nathan's intentions in their full scope, plans for psychological experiments, tools for manipulation, and evidence of other victims. It was clear that I was not alone. Others had suffered, others had disappeared, and I understood, with chilling clarity, what he might do if he discovered my plans. I realized then that survival required more than planning. It required patience, cunning, and emotional fortitude. I had to anticipate his moves, predict his manipulations, and maintain a facade of innocence while plotting my freedom. Each day became a test of my resolve, each night a rehearsal for the escape that I knew must come. By mid-September, I had rehearsed every movement, memorized every detail of the house, and anticipated every possible scenario. I knew Nathan's habits, his routines, and his obsessions. I knew how to avoid his surveillance, how to maintain appearances, and how to protect the evidence I had painstakingly gathered. I also realized that my plan required a critical step, confronting the truth, not directly, but strategically. I had to expose him, understand his weaknesses, and prepare for the moment when I would finally break free. The final night of September arrived with a heavy silence. The ocean roared softly in the distance, the wind whispered through the trees, and Silverbrick seemed asleep. Nathan kissed me on the forehead, whispered assurances, and left for one of his late meetings. I stayed awake, heart pounding, mind alert. Every piece of my plan was in place. Every contingency accounted for. The escape I had dreamed of, planned for, and feared had become imminent. I knew that the coming days would determine everything. My freedom, my safety, and my life beyond the walls of my prison. I had discovered the darkness behind the smile, and now I was ready to step into the light, armed with knowledge, courage, and the determination to survive. The night I decided to confront Nathan Cole was the first night I truly felt both fear and power at the same time. Fear, because I knew the depths of his obsession; power, because I had uncovered every hidden corner of his life, every secret, every lie. I was no longer the naive wife who trusted blindly. I was an observer, a strategist, and a survivor. Silverbrick streets were silent under a blanket of fog. The ocean murmured below the cliffs, like a low warning of what was to come. I had waited months for this moment, preparing every step, rehearsing every movement. I knew the risks. I knew that one wrong action could be fatal. But the truth had to be revealed. I had to face the man behind the smile. Nathan returned from his evening meeting later than usual. I had monitored his movements through the hidden cameras, and I knew he had nothing planned for the night, yet his presence in the house was suffocating. His smile was calm, his voice gentle, the mask of the perfect husband intact. "Ariana, you look tired," he said, approaching me in the living room. His hand brushed my shoulder, casual, affectionate, yet controlled. I smiled back, hiding the tension in my chest. "Just a long day," I replied softly. I could see the faint flicker of suspicion in his eyes, though he masked it quickly. He had noticed changes before, small ones, a hesitation in my voice, a glance I couldn't hide. But tonight, I would not hesitate. Tonight, I would act. I led him to the study, pretending to need help with a financial document. He followed, unsuspecting. As he closed the door behind him, I activated the recording devices I had hidden over the past weeks, cameras, audio recorders, even the small digital spy device I had tucked into a corner of the room. Every movement he made tonight would be documented. "Nathan, we need to talk," I said, my voice calm, but firm. His eyes narrowed, but he maintained his smile. "Of course, Ariana. What is it?" I took a deep breath. "I know everything." For a moment, his expression didn't change. Then a subtle tension rippled across his shoulders. "Everything? What exactly do you mean?" he asked, carefully measured. "Don't play games," I said, my hands trembling slightly. "The pills, the cameras, the files, the women. I know you've been watching me, cataloging me, controlling every part of my life. I know what you've been doing to others. And I know that I am not your only subject." For a long moment, he stared at me, unreadable, calculating. Then, a smile crept across his face, not kind, not loving, but something cold, predatory. "You've been very observant, Ariana," he said slowly. "I almost admire your attention to detail." Almost. I realized then that Nathan Cole had underestimated me. He had assumed compliance, assumed fear would keep me silent, assumed that my obedience was permanent. He had not accounted for months of preparation, careful observation, or the courage that had been growing inside me with every hidden note, every secret recording, every calculated plan. I stepped closer. "You need to understand something," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "This isn't just about escape. This is about exposing you. Everyone you've manipulated, controlled, and harmed, they will know the truth. And I will make sure of it." His eyes darkened. There was a flicker of anger, then amusement. "Do you really think you can escape, Ariana? Do you really think you understand the magnitude of what you're dealing with?" I held my ground. "I understand enough." Then he moved, subtly at first, testing, circling me like a predator assessing prey. I noticed every shift in his stance, every tension in his hands, every tiny signal that gave away his intent. He tried intimidation, tried manipulation through charm, but it no longer worked. I was prepared. I had rehearsed this confrontation in my mind hundreds of times, and I would not falter now. "Nathan, I know about the other women," I said. "About the files, the diaries, the photos. I know what you've done. And if you think you can stop me with fear, you're wrong." He laughed softly, a sound that sent chills down my spine. "Oh, Ariana, you've learned, haven't you? You've been planning, calculating, watching me like I watched you. Clever, dangerous, admirable, almost. This ends tonight," I said. "No more manipulation, no more control, no more lies. I am done being your subject. I am done being afraid." He studied me silently, then nodded slowly. "Very well," he said. "Let's see how far your courage really goes." What followed was a psychological battle unlike anything I had anticipated. Nathan tried to unsettle me with truths I hadn't known I feared, with manipulations designed to exploit weaknesses he assumed I still had. He questioned my motives, my memories, my perceptions. He played on my empathy, on my guilt, on my fear for the safety of others. But I countered each move. I had prepared. Every argument he raised, every attempt to destabilize me, I deflected, neutralized, or documented. My calm, my observation, my knowledge of him, these became my weapons. Hours passed. The confrontation escalated, tension thickening the air. Nathan grew increasingly agitated, his calm veneer cracking as he realized that I was no longer the frightened, compliant woman he had married. I stood my ground, unwavering, every detail of his manipulations exposed to me, every secret within reach through the recordings and files I had gathered. "Do you think this changes anything?" He finally spat, voice trembling slightly. "Do you think your little plan matters?" "Yes," I said quietly. "It matters because I am not afraid anymore. Because I know you. Because I have the evidence. And because I will survive." By the time the night ended, Nathan Cole was forced to acknowledge a truth he had never expected. I was no longer his subject, no longer under his control, and no longer naive. I had transformed fear into strategy, observation into power, and silence into action. I left the study with a calm determination. The confrontation had not ended with a resolution, but it had shifted the balance. Nathan had been revealed, to me, and to himself. And now, the next phase of my plan, the escape, the exposure, the reclaiming of my life was within reach. As I lay in bed that night, adrenaline still thrumming through my veins, I realized how much I had grown. The woman who had entered this marriage trusting blindly, the woman who had taken the pills without question, the woman who had feared every shadow, had been replaced by someone stronger, sharper, and more aware. The darkness behind Nathan's smile had been unveiled. The predator had been confronted. And now, it was only a matter of time before the world would know the truth. The morning air in Silverbrick was crisp, carrying the scent of the ocean and salt. But inside our house, the tension was palpable. The walls, which had once felt like home, now loomed like silent witnesses to years of control and fear. I had waited months for this day, the day when I would no longer be a subject, a prisoner, or a silent observer of Nathan Cole's obsession. The plan was simple in theory, but execution required every ounce of precision I had accumulated over months of careful observation and preparation. Every step I took, every movement I made, was calculated. I knew Nathan's routines, his weaknesses, his obsessions. And now it was time to use that knowledge to reclaim my life. I began by ensuring that the evidence I had gathered, videos, photos, files, journals, was securely backed up. Multiple devices, hidden in locations he would never suspect, contained the documentation of everything he had done. The recordings of his manipulations, the files on other victims, the detailed notes, all of it would be the key to exposing him, should anything go wrong. Next, I had to create an alibi. I left subtle notes in the house, minor signs of normalcy that would distract him. He had become suspicious over the past months, always testing, probing, analyzing. Any sudden change would alert him. But my movements had to appear natural. Every step, every gesture, had to reinforce the illusion of compliance. Nathan emerged from the study that morning, impeccably dressed as always, carrying the calm facade that had hidden so much darkness. He smiled at me, a practiced gesture, eyes glinting with the faintest hint of suspicion. "Good morning, Ariana. Did you sleep well?" I returned the smile, measured and careful. "Yes, I did. Thank you." He seemed satisfied, though I could sense the faint tension under the surface. His need for control was strong, but I had grown adept at navigating it. I had rehearsed every response, every interaction, for months. Today was the day that knowledge would save me. By mid-morning, I executed the first phase of my plan. I left the house under the pretext of running errands, carrying only what Nathan would consider trivial, a small bag with a few personal items, nothing that would raise alarm. Hidden within the lining of the bag were micro SD cards containing the most incriminating evidence I had gathered. As I drove through the quiet streets of Silverbrick, I felt a mixture of fear and exhilaration. Every mile away from the house, every turn toward freedom, was a step toward reclaiming my life. Yet I remained acutely aware of the danger. Nathan had been watching for months. One misstep, one unnoticed detail, and he could intercept me before I even reached safety. My first stop was a small rental office in a neighboring town. I had secured a temporary residence months ago, under a false name, as part of my contingency plan. The office clerk, oblivious to the drama behind my request, handed me the keys and documents. I felt a flicker of triumph. For the first time in years, I had taken a decisive step away from his control. But the escape was not yet complete. I needed to secure communication with a trusted ally, someone outside Nathan's reach who could assist if he discovered my movements. I had contacted Eleanor, a friend from college, who had become aware of some of my struggles months ago. She had been my silent confidant, someone I could trust with the truth and who could act as a lifeline in this critical moment. As I reached Eleanor's house, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. My heart stopped. I knew immediately, Nathan had discovered something. The message was brief: "I know what you're doing. Don't try to run." Fear surged, but it was tempered by resolve. I had anticipated this. Every contingency was in place. I contacted Eleanor, and within minutes, she had arrived with her car, ready to assist. Together, we drove to the temporary residence I had secured, taking every precaution to avoid surveillance and detection. Once safely inside, I began the second phase of the plan, exposing Nathan Cole. I uploaded the evidence to secure, encrypted servers, ensured multiple backups were created, and drafted messages to authorities, journalists, and trusted allies. Every piece of documentation, the videos, photographs, journals, and financial records, was catalogued, ready to dismantle the facade Nathan had built over years. As I worked, I reflected on the months of fear, observation, and preparation. Every late night, every hidden camera, every secret note, every rehearsal had led to this moment. I was no longer a passive participant in my life. I was the architect of my freedom. Meanwhile, back in Silverbrick, Nathan began to realize that his control was slipping. His obsession with my compliance, his surveillance, and his manipulations had failed. He noticed subtle discrepancies, missed movements, unexplained absences. Panic began to replace his usual composure. The predator who had once held all power was confronted with the first real challenge of his carefully constructed life: me, unbroken, aware, and determined. He called, leaving cryptic, threatening messages. But by this point, I was prepared. I documented everything, ensuring that his attempts to intimidate or coerce me would serve as evidence against him. The psychological tables had turned. Nathan was no longer the one in control. Days passed as I strengthened my position. I coordinated with authorities, ensured my new residence remained secure, and continued to monitor Nathan from a safe distance through discreet surveillance. Every action I took reinforced my independence and protected the evidence I had gathered. I also took time to care for myself. For months, fear had dominated my life, leaving me exhausted and anxious. I focused on regaining strength, both physical and emotional, understanding that survival was not just about escape, but about rebuilding myself after the trauma I had endured. Then, one afternoon, I received confirmation that everything was moving forward. Authorities had begun investigating, journalists were preparing to report, and legal measures were being put in place to prevent Nathan from continuing his manipulations. The network of secrecy he had relied upon for years was unraveling. I allowed myself a quiet moment of relief. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of agency. I had turned fear into strategy, oppression into observation, and isolation into action. I had reclaimed my life, one calculated step at a time. As night fell over Silverbrick, I looked out at the ocean from my temporary residence. The waves crashed against the cliffs, relentless and unyielding, yet beautiful. I felt a similar strength rising within me, relentless, unyielding, and beautiful in its own right. Nathan Cole's reign of control was ending. My freedom, hard-won and meticulously planned, was beginning. And I knew that the coming weeks would not just be about survival, but about justice, exposing the man who had tried to erase me and ensuring that no one else would fall victim to his dark obsession. I had broken free, but the story was far from over. The final confrontation, the ultimate revelation of truth, and the journey toward healing and closure awaited. I was ready. The first mornings after my escape were both terrifying and exhilarating. Silverbrick, which had once felt like a prison, was now a memory I could observe from a distance. I lived in a safe house, surrounded by people I trusted, Eleanor, my friend and confidant, and a few discreet allies who understood the danger Nathan posed. For the first time, I could breathe without calculating every step, every glance, every word. But the weight of what I had endured was heavy, and healing would not come overnight. The first thing I learned in those days was that survival is not merely the act of leaving, it is the act of reclaiming oneself. For years, Nathan Cole had dictated my life, my thoughts, even my emotions. I had obeyed, adapted, and endured. Now, I had to rediscover Ariana Blake, the woman beyond the fear, the shadows, the manipulation. I started small, simple rituals, brewing coffee in the morning, walking along the ocean in solitude, journaling without fear of discovery. Each act was a reclaiming of autonomy, a subtle reminder that I belonged to myself and not to Nathan Cole. I also began reviewing the evidence I had collected, now with a new perspective. Videos, photographs, files, these were not merely tools for exposure, they were records of survival. Each file, each note, each hidden camera was a testament to resilience. And as I organized and documented everything, I felt a surge of power. I was no longer a passive observer in my own life, I was the author of my story. Nathan, meanwhile, was unraveling. News reports began circulating, cautiously at first, then more definitively, exposing his manipulations and illegal surveillance activities. Authorities were involved, his network of control was being dismantled, and the people he had victimized began coming forward. The man who had once controlled my every movement, my every thought, now found himself trapped in the consequences of his obsession. I watched from a distance as his carefully curated world crumbled. Emails went unanswered. Meetings were cancelled. Friends who had once served as unwitting accomplices disappeared. The psychological collapse I had anticipated was underway. Nathan Cole, the predator who had haunted my life, was now forced to face the truth of his actions. As the days passed, I allowed myself moments of reflection. I thought about the years lost to fear, the nights spent trembling, the pills I had taken without choice. I grieved for the woman I had been, but I also celebrated the woman I had become. Stronger, wiser, unyielding, I began rebuilding my personal life. Slowly, cautiously, I allowed myself to experience joy again, the simple pleasures of sunrise, a cup of tea, laughter with Eleanor, the scent of the ocean breeze. Each moment was a reminder that life could exist beyond fear, that happiness could be reclaimed even after trauma. One afternoon, while walking along the cliffs near Silverbrick, I reflected on the lessons I had learned. Strength is not merely physical, it is emotional, psychological, and spiritual. Survival is not only about avoiding danger, it is about understanding oneself, recognizing patterns, and reclaiming autonomy. And courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. I also realized the power of voice. By speaking my truth, documenting my experiences, and exposing Nathan Cole, I had transformed fear into action. The woman who had once hidden in silence now had a platform, a voice, and a purpose. Meanwhile, legal proceedings against Nathan progressed. Evidence I had meticulously collected formed the basis of a case that would prevent him from harming anyone else. Each court appearance, each testimony, each report reinforced the fact that I had survived, and that others would be protected because of my courage. I followed these developments carefully, noting the psychological unraveling of a man who had believed he was untouchable. Nathan's obsession, once a source of terror for me, became the very thing that led to his exposure. His downfall was methodical, inevitable, and poetic in its justice. As the weeks turned into months, I began to envision a future free from fear. I explored new hobbies, met new people cautiously, and allowed myself to dream again. Silverbrick remained a part of my past, but my new life was being written in a place of safety, autonomy, and hope. Healing was not instantaneous. There were nights when memories resurfaced, when anxiety crept back, when fear tried to reclaim a hold. But I met each challenge with the tools I had developed: mindfulness, observation, documentation, and the unwavering belief that I was no longer powerless. I also took time to support others. Victims who had once been silent now reached out, and I provided guidance, encouragement, and shared the lessons I had learned. Together, we began to form a network of resilience, a community bound not by fear but by survival, courage, and solidarity. Through this process, I realized that freedom was not merely the absence of Nathan Cole, it was the presence of agency, the reclamation of identity, and the ability to define one's own life. By the time autumn arrived, I had begun to feel whole again. The trauma remained, etched into memory, but it no longer dictated my existence. I walked along the cliffs with a sense of purpose, reflecting on the months of struggle, the nights of fear, and the painstaking preparation that had led to my liberation. I had faced the darkness behind Nathan's smile, confronted the man who had tried to control and erase me, and survived. And in surviving, I had discovered strength I had never known existed. Looking forward, I knew life would never be perfect, but it would be mine. Every decision, every choice, every step would be taken with awareness and courage. I had reclaimed Ariana Blake from the shadows of fear, and nothing, not even the memory of Nathan Cole, could ever take that away. I had learned to live again. To trust cautiously, to love selectively, to act deliberately. And in doing so, I had transformed my story from one of victimhood to one of resilience, power, and unshakable courage. The morning light in Silverbrick was soft, a gentle glow illuminating the ocean and cliffs, as if the world itself had exhaled after months of tension. For me, the morning was symbolic, a new beginning, a life reclaimed from the shadow of fear. After months of planning, confrontation, escape, and rebuilding, I finally felt the weight of Nathan Cole's control lifting from my shoulders. It had taken months, meticulous preparation, and unwavering courage to reach this point. The legal system, aided by the evidence I had gathered, had ensured Nathan could no longer threaten me or anyone else. Court proceedings had revealed his manipulations, his surveillance, and his obsession in chilling detail. Every file, every recording, every journal I had hidden and documented became the backbone of a case that would prevent him from harming anyone again. Nathan Cole, the man who had haunted my nights and dominated my days, had been exposed in the full light of truth. The predator who had once seemed untouchable was now constrained by law, facing the consequences of his actions. I felt a sense of justice, tempered by relief, coursing through me. As I walked through the quiet streets of Silverbrick that morning, memories of the past years flashed vividly. Nights spent in fear, pills taken without choice, manipulated smiles, whispered words of control. Yet I no longer felt the weight of those memories as a burden. They were lessons, reminders of resilience, and proof of the strength that had carried me through. I reflected on the months of preparation, the hidden cameras, the careful observations, the secret journals, the rehearsed interactions. Every action, every note, every detail had brought me here, to safety, to agency, to freedom. And in that reflection, I realized something profound. I had survived not just by hiding or obeying, but by becoming fully aware of my surroundings, my choices, and my own power. My safe house had become a sanctuary. Eleanor and I often spent mornings drinking coffee by the windows, watching the sunrise over the cliffs. She had been my confidant, my ally, my anchor during the most perilous months of my life. Together, we celebrated small victories, the removal of Nathan from power, the closure of his network, the assurance that no one else would fall victim to his manipulations. The psychological journey was ongoing. Healing from trauma is not linear. There were days when anxiety resurfaced, nights when memories crept back, moments when fear tried to reclaim its hold. But each time, I met it with mindfulness, with preparation, and with the unshakable knowledge that I was no longer powerless. The woman who had walked into marriage trusting blindly had transformed into someone resilient, cautious, and self-aware. Nathan's psychological collapse had become public knowledge. Reports detailed his obsessive behavior, his manipulative tactics, and his illegal surveillance. Friends, associates, and acquaintances who had once unknowingly aided him were interviewed. The man who had tried to control my life so completely had been stripped of his power, exposed to the world he had hidden behind polished smiles and calculated charm. I watched as his empire crumbled. Emails went unanswered, meetings were cancelled, and his influence evaporated. The control he had once wielded effortlessly was now gone. And for the first time, I allowed myself a quiet satisfaction. Justice had been served, not through revenge, but through meticulous planning, awareness, and courage. Rebuilding my life meant more than just escaping Nathan. It meant reclaiming the person I had been forced to suppress. I explored Silverbrick anew, not as a prisoner of fear, but as someone rediscovering the beauty in ordinary moments, the sound of the ocean, the sunlight glinting off the waves, the laughter of children playing on the pier. Each sensation reminded me that life could exist beyond trauma, that joy could coexist with past pain, and that healing was possible. I also began documenting my journey publicly, cautiously, to inspire others who might be trapped in similar situations. By sharing my story, I transformed fear into empowerment, not just for myself, but for anyone who might read or hear it. The act of speaking, of giving voice to my experiences, was therapeutic. It was a reclaiming of autonomy that Nathan had once tried to deny me. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. I moved into a permanent residence, distant from the shadows of the past, surrounded by supportive friends and allies. I engaged in therapy, participated in support groups, and immersed myself in activities that nurtured both mind and body. Freedom was no longer a goal, it was a lived reality. Nathan, meanwhile, faced legal consequences for his actions. His obsession, which had once dictated my every movement, became the very evidence of his downfall. Authorities detailed his manipulations, the networks of surveillance he maintained, and the psychological experiments he conducted. Every action he had taken to control me and others became the foundation of his exposure. The man who had once seemed invincible was now fully accountable. One quiet evening, I stood on the cliffs overlooking Silverbrick, the wind in my hair, the ocean stretching endlessly before me. I thought about the woman I had been, frightened, obedient, silenced, and the woman I had become, resilient, aware, and empowered. Every fear I had endured, every manipulation I had faced, had forged the strength that allowed me to survive and thrive. I realized that freedom is not simply the absence of a threat, it is the presence of agency. It is the power to choose, to speak, to act, and to live without fear. By reclaiming my life, I had transformed trauma into strength, oppression into awareness, and survival into triumph. As the sun set over the cliffs, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, I allowed myself a moment of gratitude. For Eleanor, for my father Thomas, for my own resilience, and for the lessons learned through pain and perseverance. I had survived Nathan Cole. I had exposed the truth. I had reclaimed my life. And now, I could move forward, fully aware, fully present, and fully free. This was not the end of my story, healing and growth would continue, but it was the closure I had longed for. The darkness behind Nathan's smile had been confronted, and I had emerged unbroken. The past no longer controlled me. I was Ariana Blake, free, empowered, and ready to embrace life on my own terms.